Let me introduce you. This is the woman I have been living with since you left to give birth. My husband grinned, his arm draped around the bare shoulders of the woman beside him. She leaned against him as if she had always belonged there. While I had been at my parents' house, recovering and caring for our newborn twins, my husband had moved his mistress into our home. She stood there, acting as though she had every right to be there. "This is your fault," he said, his voice sharp. "You got pregnant, you stopped taking care of the house, and you will not even sleep with me. What is the point of staying married?" He had always dismissed my suffering. When I was overwhelmed by morning sickness, he insisted it was not a real illness. He made it clear that, in his eyes, I was nothing more than a burden. His resentment only grew after the birth of our children. When the babies cried, startled by his raised voice, he glared at them with open disdain. "I want a divorce. Take those brats and get out." I did not argue. I held my children close, turned my back on him, and prepared to leave. To an outsider, it might have seemed like I had no choice but to walk away. But I was not alone. I had someone on my side, someone who could turn this entire situation against him in an instant. That someone was my father. "You are the one who is going to suffer from this divorce," my father said, his voice low and steady. My husband's smug expression faltered. "What? This has nothing to do with you. Just take Nancy and go." My father met his gaze without blinking. "Are you sure about that?" The moment those words left his mouth, my husband and his mistress paled. They had no idea what was coming. "My name is Nancy, and I am 60 years old. I have twins, a boy and a girl. My son, Daniel, and my daughter, Jackie, are the most important people in my life. Their father's name is Stanley. I met Stanley when we were both in college." He had lost his parents young and worked multiple jobs to cover tuition and living expenses. He was smart, good-looking, but always tried to keep a low profile, uncomfortable with the attention he received from women. I admired his resilience. He had faced so much, yet he worked hard to build a future for himself. My feelings for him grew, and after persistently trying to get closer, we eventually started dating. Even after we became a couple, not much changed. Stanley was not the type to express emotions easily. He stayed focused on his goals. After graduate school, he landed a job at a major financial firm, one of the top companies in the country. It was a difficult place to get hired, but Stanley's intelligence and work ethic got him in. He worked in sales and quickly started earning more than many of his peers. I knew he was proud of himself. He had built something from nothing. But success changed him. The quiet, disciplined man I had fallen for began spending money carelessly. His appearance became flashier, and he developed a taste for luxury. At first, I thought it was just part of his job. Maybe he needed to look successful to gain the trust of clients. But deep down, something felt off. Still, I ignored my doubts. I wanted to believe in him. 2 years after we both started working, I found out I was pregnant. When I told Stanley, he accepted the news, and soon we were married. I thought I had everything I had ever wanted. I was wrong. At about 2 months pregnant, I was hit with severe morning sickness. I could barely stand, let alone work. My health deteriorated quickly, and I had to miss days at my job. At the time, maternity leave policies were not as developed as they are now, and many women left their jobs after marriage or pregnancy. I had no choice. I resigned, determined to focus on my baby's health. Stanley did not approve. Every night when he came home from work, he would sigh loudly at the sight of me in bed. "Slacking off again? The house is a mess, and dinner is not even ready?" I tried to explain. "I have been throwing up all day. I cannot even keep water down. I am worried about whether the baby is growing properly. Pregnancy is not an illness," he snapped. "I did not agree to you quitting your job just so you could lie around all day. You cannot even do basic housework? Useless." He spoke like I had betrayed him, like I had taken something from him. And as my pregnancy progressed, his resentment only deepened. Carrying twins made everything harder. My body struggled under the extra weight, and my condition never improved, not even after reaching the so-called stable period. I begged Stanley for help, but he refused to lift a finger. The stress, the exhaustion, and my worsening health eventually led to a medical emergency. I was diagnosed with a high-risk pregnancy and warned that if I did not rest, I might go into early labor. I should have left then. But I was still clinging to the belief that things would get better. That once the babies arrived, Stanley would change. I could not have been more wrong. I decided to return to my parents' home to rest and recover. The thought of being away from Stanley gave me a sense of relief, but it did not last long. Shortly after I arrived, Stanley called. "It is not right for you to just leave like that," he said, irritation clear in his voice. "I cannot even get a proper meal or clean laundry done. You cannot just dump all your responsibilities on your parents." "Stanley, I need to focus on my health and prepare for the birth," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Are you talking back to me?" His voice turned sharp. "I am the one supporting you, and this is how you act? Do not bother coming back." Before I could say anything else, he hung up. I stared at the phone, frozen. His words were still ringing in my ears. No concern for me. No concern for our unborn children. Just himself, always himself. "Nancy? What is wrong?" My father's voice broke through my daze. He had noticed something was off and came over, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. That warmth, that concern, it was all it took for me to break down. The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over. My father did not push for answers. Instead, he called my mother into the room, and together they sat with me while I told them everything. I told them about Stanley's cruelty, the way he treated me like a burden ever since I got pregnant. I told them how I had been living in fear, wondering if things would get even worse after the babies were born. And for the first time, I admitted something I had been too scared to say out loud. "I think I might need to divorce him." My voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry for being an ungrateful daughter." Both my parents listened quietly until I finished. Then my father spoke. "If you want a divorce, that is fine," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "This is your home too, Nancy. You can always come back here. And there is no need to apologize. If anything, we would rather hear words of gratitude than an apology." My mother nodded beside him, offering me a soft smile. That was the first time in months that I felt a sense of peace. I thought about my unborn children. I wanted to give them the same love and support my parents had given me. I wanted them to grow up feeling safe and cherished. For the first time since my pregnancy began, I allowed myself to believe that things could be okay. From that moment on, I heard nothing from Stanley. Since I did not return home, I had no idea how he was living, and I did not have the courage to reach out. Several months later, I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They arrived a little earlier than expected, but they were strong and healthy. I named them Daniel and Jackie, names I had decided on early in my pregnancy. When I had mentioned them to Stanley, he barely paid attention and just said, "It is up to you." My parents loved their names. From the moment they were born, they showered them with love, calling out their names with warmth and pride. After the birth, my father called Stanley to inform him that the twins had arrived. His response? "I am too busy with work." He did not even bother to come see them. I had always known Stanley was indifferent, but this was something else. The first month after birth was overwhelming. Caring for newborn twins was nothing short of exhausting, but my parents were there to help me every step of the way. I could not have done it without them. Even after a full month had passed, Stanley still had not visited. Originally, I had planned to return to our home after the first month postpartum. My father had informed Stanley of this plan, but Stanley never came to pick us up. With no choice, my father drove me and the babies to our home himself. As we pulled up to the house, I felt a mix of emotions. I had not seen Stanley in months. A part of me wondered if, just maybe, seeing his children for the first time would change him. Maybe he would finally step up. Maybe he would want to be a father. I clung to that tiny, foolish hope as I stepped up to the door, Jackie in my arms while my father carried Daniel. But when I opened the door, my entire world shattered. Right next to Stanley's leather shoes was a pair of high heels. Not mine. Not something I would have worn while pregnant. Someone else's. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I stepped inside, drawn forward by some invisible force. Nancy, wait! My father called after me, but I was already moving. I pushed open the living room door. And there they were. Stanley. And a woman. Their clothes were scattered around them. Her hands were on him. They were half-dressed, but it was clear what had been happening before I walked in. The sight hit me like a punch to the stomach. The woman, startled by my sudden entrance, scrambled to cover herself. Stanley, for a split second, looked shocked. But then, instead of guilt, something worse crossed his face. Amusement. As if this was all some joke. Then he laughed. "Let me introduce you," he said, grinning. "This is Harriet. She is my co-worker. Since you went to your parents' house, she has been living here with me." I felt like I had been thrown into another reality. Harriet, young, polished, and completely at ease, looked me straight in the eye and smirked. "I am sorry," she said, voice dripping with insincerity. "But Stanley told me all about you. How you stopped taking care of the house, how you abandoned him just because you got pregnant. It is not my fault. You drove him away." I could barely comprehend what I was hearing. Stanley leaned back against the couch, pulling Harriet close. "Honestly, I never even wanted to get married yet," he said, shaking his head. "I wanted to focus on my career and enjoy life. You getting pregnant ruined everything. You stopped cooking, cleaning, and you will not even sleep with me anymore. What is the point of this marriage?" His voice had turned harsh, but I barely noticed. Because Daniel and Jackie had started to cry, startled by his raised voice. Stanley groaned, rubbing his temples. "God, I hate kids." Then he looked right at me. "I want a divorce. Take those noisy brats and get out." Harriet smiled, curling against him. "That is right. This is our home now." Stanley draped his arm around her, completely at ease, as if none of this mattered. As if I, his wife, the mother of his children, was already gone. I clutched Jackie tighter. My father held Daniel close. I had nothing left to say. Stanley had made his choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. I wanted to say something, to express my anger, but no words came. My mind was still clouded from childbirth, and everything that had happened was too much to process. Holding Jackie tightly, I turned away from Stanley. "Dad, let's go," I said. Just as I stepped toward the door, my father finally spoke. "You are the one who will suffer from this divorce." His voice was calm but firm, unlike anything I had ever heard from him before. He looked straight at Stanley, his expression unreadable. "This has nothing to do with you," Stanley scoffed. "Just leave with Nancy." "You both work at the same company, right?" my father asked. "Yeah," Stanley replied, smugly. "It is a top-tier company, the kind an old man like you could never dream of working for." "I see," my father nodded. "Then I suppose workplace affairs are against company policy?" Stanley frowned. "What are you trying to say?" My father slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Stanley hesitated before taking it. The moment he read it, his face drained of color. "Legal counsel?" he stammered. "That is right. I provide legal services for multiple major corporations, including your company." That is a lie." "It is not," my father continued. "I have been involved with your company for years. In fact, I was one of the people who helped you get hired." "What?" Stanley's face twisted in confusion. "When you were job hunting, you told me about your dream of working there. You had potential, and I wanted to help, so I recommended you to the right people. Even if you had not been my daughter's boyfriend, I would have done the same. Stanley opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. I never told you because I knew you had your pride, my father said. But it seems I made a mistake in helping you. Stanley clenched his fists. What does any of this have to do with you? Workplace affairs violate company policy, my father continued. If discovered, it damages the company's reputation and trust with clients. And unfortunately for you, I have already conducted an independent investigation. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. Inside were photos, documents, evidence. Stanley's hands trembled as he flipped through them. This is records of your misconduct at work, my father said. Bullying younger employees, harassing female colleagues, taking long breaks and skipping meetings. It was all reported by a brave employee who had the courage to speak up. Stanley's breathing grew unsteady. Your company has already begun discussing disciplinary action. It is just a matter of time before you receive official notice. You will not be able to keep your job. Harriet grabbed Stanley's arm. That is not true, right? But Stanley could not answer. My father sighed. Earlier, you told my daughter to leave this house. He looked at Stanley coldly. But if anyone is leaving, it is you. This building belongs to me. What? When the previous owner put the building up for sale, I bought it. Notices were sent to all tenants, but you must not have bothered to read them. Stanley's hands curled into fists, but he had no comeback. I do not enjoy being forceful, my father continued. But if you are going to mistreat my daughter and children, I will not hesitate to evict you. Stanley looked completely lost, unable to process everything unfolding before him. Harriet, realizing the situation was worse than she had expected, clung to him desperately. How dare you treat my daughter and grandchildren like this? My father said, his voice harder than I had ever heard. I will never forgive you. Be prepared for the consequences. Stanley slammed his hand on the floor in frustration. That does not matter, I said, standing tall. I am divorcing you. I will speak with my father and ensure I receive alimony and child support. And Harriet? I will be seeking damages from you as well. Harriet gasped. Damages? But ignoring her, I turned to leave, keeping my children from looking at Stanley. As I stepped out, I glanced back one last time. Stanley was still on the floor, shaking his head. His expression was pure disbelief, as if he still could not comprehend what had happened. The divorce was finalized quickly. With my father's influence, Stanley was fired from his job and evicted from the apartment. He struggled to maintain any stability. Later, my father told me what had happened next. Harriet, who had been so attached to Stanley, abandoned him as soon as he lost his job and home. She disappeared without a trace. As for the alimony, it was being deposited into my account regularly. When I asked about it, I learned that Harriet's parents had paid the amount on Stanley's behalf. They were furious when they found out what she had done and disowned her. With no support from her family, Harriet struggled financially and ended up working at a nightclub. After the divorce, I continued living with my parents while raising Daniel and Jackie. I considered moving out, but my parents insisted I stay. Raising 2 children alone will not be easy, they said. Watching Daniel and Jackie sleeping peacefully beside me one night, I turned to my father. Dad, thank you for everything, I said. My father smiled. Hearing that makes it all worth it. I do not understand why you say that, I admitted. You will one day. At the time, I did not fully grasp what he meant. 20 years passed. Daniel and Jackie grew up, following in their grandfather's footsteps. He taught them the importance of gratitude, and they never hesitated to express it. Then, 2 years ago, my father was diagnosed with cancer. By the time we found out, it was already too late. Even in his final days, he never lost his warmth. He smiled until the very end. During his funeral, I kept repeating one thing in my heart. Thank you, Dad. Around the same time, Stanley's child support payments stopped. He had agreed to pay until Daniel and Jackie finished university, but the payments became irregular and eventually stopped completely. It was as if he had been waiting for my father to pass before abandoning his responsibilities entirely. Stanley had disappeared completely. I had no idea where he was or what he had been doing all these years. Since my elderly mother required nursing care, I had no time to track him down. Eventually, I gave up trying. Thankfully, my father had left behind a generous inheritance, which allowed me to send Daniel and Jackie to university without financial worries. 10 years passed. By then, Daniel and Jackie had turned 30. After my mother passed away and the children moved out, I sold the family home and started living alone. One warm afternoon, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there. Daniel? What are you doing here? Do you have the day off? Yes, it is my first break in a while, he said, holding up a small box. I brought your favorite cake. Let's eat together. Oh, how unusual. I am happy. Come in. I prepared coffee as Daniel sat at the table. After finishing medical school, Daniel became a surgeon at a large general hospital. Ever since learning that my father's cancer was too advanced to treat, he had dedicated his life to helping as many patients as possible. He barely took time off, which worried me, but he always said his work was fulfilling. I was proud of the man he had become. As I poured the coffee, Daniel took a sip and casually said, "By the way, something interesting happened the other day." I lifted a slice of cake and looked at him curiously. Stanley was admitted to my hospital. I froze. Daniel explained that he had seen Stanley's name on a medical chart and checked to confirm it was really him. It was. Stanley arrived for his appointment with a woman about Daniel's age. The moment he saw Daniel's face and the name on his name tag, his expression twisted in shock. "Why are you here?" Stanley had blurted out. "Well, I am your assigned surgeon," Daniel replied. That cannot be true." Until child support payments had stopped, Stanley and the children had met occasionally. Seeing Daniel up close, with the same small mole under his eye from childhood, must have confirmed his worst fears. Suddenly, Stanley turned pale and grabbed the nurse beside him. "Please transfer me to another hospital," he begged. "Or at least give me a different doctor. Otherwise, I will be killed." The nurse looked at him in confusion. Despite being in a hospital, Stanley started shouting and clinging to the woman next to him, his new wife. "I abandoned him. I abandoned his mother right after she gave birth. I had an affair. I stopped paying child support after her scary father died. Of course, he hates me. He is going to take revenge." Daniel calmly replied, "If you are asking whether I hate you, yes, I do." Stanley's panic escalated. "You are going to fail the surgery on purpose, aren't you? Please do not kill me. I will borrow money if I have to. I will pay back everything I owe." Without being asked a single question, Stanley revealed everything on his own. His new wife, who had apparently been unaware of his past, stood frozen in shock. Then, as if realizing she had made a mistake in marrying him, she turned and walked out of the room without another word. Stanley was restrained by hospital staff and taken to a separate area. The commotion had spread through the hospital, and a small crowd had gathered outside the examination room, whispering about what they had just witnessed. "That is not a funny story," I sighed, rubbing my forehead. Daniel shrugged. "It was quite the scene." Just then, another voice interrupted. "There is more to the story." I turned to see Jackie standing at the door. "Jackie? How did you forgot to lock the door after Daniel arrived," she scolded, walking in. She sat down across from us and placed a bag on the table. "More to the story?" I asked. Jackie smirked. "Stanley's wife came to me for divorce consultation." "What?" Jackie had followed in my father's footsteps and become a lawyer. Since childhood, she had dreamed of practicing law like her grandfather. She passed the bar exam while still in university and now worked at a firm near my home, preparing to open her own practice. She explained that a new client had come in recently, claiming she had been deceived by her husband. When I asked for the husband's name, I did not expect to hear Stanley, Jackie said. I nearly dropped my fork. She nodded. After hearing about what happened at the hospital from Daniel, it all made sense. Daniel smirked. That must have been unfortunate for her. By now, she has probably realized what kind of man she married, Jackie said. But here is the funny part. Stanley has not learned his lesson at all. I sighed. Why am I not surprised? Jackie took out her phone and scrolled. In my experience, cheaters rarely change, she said. So, I introduced her to a private investigator. And guess what? He was cheating on her, too. Daniel groaned. Unbelievable. Jackie shrugged. She was furious and wanted to sue for compensation. I passed the case to a colleague who specializes in divorce cases. I shook my head. He really is hopeless. We never saw him as a father anyway, Daniel said. So I cannot even feel sorry for him. Jackie agreed. We never needed a dad. We had Mom. And Grandpa and Grandma were always there for us. Hearing them laugh together, I thought back to the past. If my father had not stepped in that day, I might have ended up raising Daniel and Jackie in a terrible environment. I owed everything to my parents. At the same time, I often wondered, did I do enough as a mother? By the way, Jackie, Daniel said, what happened to that thing? It should be arriving any minute now. Right as she said that, the doorbell rang. I started to get up, but Daniel stopped me. Jackie went to the door instead. Daniel grinned at me. I raised an eyebrow. What is going on? Jackie returned, holding a bouquet of bright red carnations. Daniel and Jackie exchanged glances before turning to me with matching smiles. In case you forgot, they said in unison, today is Mother's Day. A few months later, something unexpected happened. Stanley suddenly deposited all the overdue child support payments at once. Daniel told me he must have borrowed the money, just like he had promised during his meltdown at the hospital. His surgery had been successful, but due to his dramatic outburst, no one at the hospital wanted to deal with him. He had become an outcast among the staff. After being discharged, his life only got worse. His new wife, furious that he had lied about his past and cheated on her, demanded a large settlement. Stanley borrowed money again and paid her off. Then, thinking he could move in with one of his other mistresses, he was met with another betrayal. The woman disappeared, not wanting to deal with his troubles. With nothing left, no job, no money, no home, Stanley was drowning in debt. From what I heard, he spent his later years alone. But that was not my concern. Several years passed. Daniel and Jackie both met wonderful partners and got married. I became a grandmother. Sometimes, my grandchildren would come over to visit, filling my house with laughter. Surrounded by my loving family, I enjoyed a peaceful and happy retirement. And for that, I would always be grateful.